I feel like ranting a bit. Perhaps this will be too much of a repeat and a bit too ragtag. From some of the themes that I was trying to cohere into a kind of a general treatment of these issues. It's very interesting. I mean, trying to deconstruct identity consciousness and identity politics, because the fundamental component parts of it, if one tries to be charitable to, like, the kind of the smallest independent kind of way of thinking that it represents, a lot of those parts can be taken as single subjects that they do have a place in intellectual life. They don't have a very vibrant place in some sense, but in some sense people do rely, and they need to be able to rely on generalizations, and it obviously is very toxic when some generalizations are politically correct and some generalizations are not politically correct, and when it should just be regarded in general that in general generalizations are pretty unhelpful when you're actually contending with something directly and confronting something specific, like having to confront and deal with a generalized fact in inverted commas. I mean, it's like saying do something about a statistic. You can't do something directly about a statistic. You first have to have an explanation for the statistic. And that explanation, that hypothesis, essentially that work is never done, and is replaced by a causal narrative or a mythology, effectively. That's what identity consciousness is based on, that you have a simplified sort of story and everything relates to that story, even when the details don't conform at all, and when there's so much evidence piling up against it, but it's just somewhat ignored by the kind of, because if the story is relented, then you lose all the efficacy of having this efficient, convenient reduction of all issues that somehow conflate and convolute morality with practical reality and pragmatism. So somehow pragmatism goes out the window because this moral story, this causal narrative that you're importing from history, a very select, tailored, mythologized history, and projecting that onto the present. Because the history that you're talking about is it's an anecdotal sort of thing that is felt, and through the feelings it is projected onto people that are meant to represent the factions that are described in the historic narrative. So it's a very sort of evil way of not thinking about things, and I mean it causes so many problems. But you can sort of treat it just within the issue of generalizations. So I mean, generally when I hear generalizations, I don't really have a reaction, because I mean, in some sense I will think, well, actually that generalization is too convenient. It basically, I only don't like generalizations when it seems to me obvious that people are using them in order to blind themselves into a false faith, into a false understanding about how things work and how things occur and how things continue to be the way they are. That seems to me, because it's that kind of convoluted projection onto reality which really causes, I mean, you can only describe it as moral corruption. Now, there was another point that I wanted to bring up, which is somewhat indirectly related. And then I have another one which is also more related, I would say. But it's interesting. I was listening to someone, and I need to find his name. And it was interesting because, he commented that in his experience, black people before the civil rights movement had a pretty good, and he's obviously generalizing, had a pretty good moral sensibility about things. And after the civil rights movement, that essentially they like to be essentially on the bad side, and he's obviously using labels here, and he's not fully substantiating exactly what he means. But I mean, he's talking about it. I mean, first of all, he's clear that he also qualified it as a generalization. He said not all black people, but mostly now. That's what it's led to, and I thought that there is actually probably something to liberation movements and the rhetoric of liberation movements and the, let's say, the lowest common denominator psychology, because it's very hard to keep a culture clean, I think. And as soon as you have a kind of device, a kind of excuse machine to enter into a form of bad faith, and then you essentially you empower the narcissistic element in any population has a narcissistic component almost naturally by their personality style. Some people are just inclined that way. But then if you empower them with rhetoric and they're able to somewhat colonize their subculture, they're able to sort of weaponize these conventions and these cultural norms, and then rely on them and depend on them, they can essentially, accountability can be shirked endlessly, and it can always just be kind of exported and projected. It's interesting, but I guess I wanted to try and come up with this thesis that there does seem to me to be a correlation between moral corruption that happens after a liberation movement, and somehow it's sort of that the liberation movement, it never actually is finished. It never actually accomplishes what it sets out to accomplish. It becomes this sort of this nebulous, vague, endless sort of process that becomes psychologized essentially. And that also, I think, has to do a lot with narrative. I mean, there are a lot of things with this form of ideology which is very close to, I think, the fundamental problem within individual psyche, within the individual psyche. And it does represent, in a cultural form, a very... it's strange. It's exactly like the Nazi culture, really, where it's always this weird paradox that it has this conspiracy, it has these accusations against the enemy of the collective, and it ends up perpetrating all of those things that it accuses the enemy of doing, because what the enemy was doing was the thing that was facilitating the injustice, and therefore it becomes the thing that actually has to be undone. And so you have this kind of reactionary reflection of the injustice that is meant to sort of bring an equilibrium to the narrative, and is very strange because they're so focused on the complaint that all they have is the mechanism of the thing that they're complaining about to sort of to be the solution. This is somewhat saying some of that stuff in a different summarized way. It's like the problem is that it becomes a psychological problem with a political solution, and so it never ends. And it does this by insulating itself and blinding itself to what the simplification of the ideological reduction and narrative is not capable of taking into account. And it gets wrapped up into the tokenism and the redemption of this collective narcissism and racialist pride that just needs to be equal. So it's just saying, oh, we just want fairness, we just want equilibrium, we just want, in inverted commas, this interpretation of social justice, although it's ironic because it works by actually destroying social justice. It doesn't have social justice in the original sort of in the way that Orwell used it, and the way that it's although it's not directly elaborated, but in the spirit and the general substance of the South African Constitution, it's obvious that it is the antithesis of social justice. And I will get into the example of that. So it's interesting, the kind of affirmative action and specific powers that the government has given to address disadvantage. In the equality Section 9 of the Bill of Rights that deals with equality. Now this has been completely betrayed by even the Constitutional Court, who has endorsed this very disgusting version of racialist social justice. But in the what the Constitution actually says essentially is that the government is allowed to address disadvantages. It's allowed to do things about disadvantage. It's allowed to set up specific government programs and policy that seeks to enhance equality. And essentially it can defend equality or it can promote it. It actually says the word "or" between those two words: promote and defend. So, if you can say that, oh, these people have a disadvantage in that what they do have is potentially vulnerable, then it can make a specific program that can sort of help to bolster that, or it can try to essentially enhance equality by tackling disadvantage through specific interventions. Now, what the government has actually done is quite disgusting. It's create this specific plan to address disadvantage via promoting identities. Instead of promoting persons that are groups which have groups of persons that have disadvantages, it's just going to identify groups of people, and it tells essentially the private sector and non-governmental entities to implement direct discrimination in order to enact this government power that is given in I believe it's subsection 2 of section 9 in the Bill of Rights. I don't have it in front of me, but and that is is evil in a lot of ways. I mean, it completely destroys the liberal values that the society is supposed to be predicated on, because essentially you've just completely destroyed freedom of association and freedom of contract as well. And you're kind of forcing them to seamlessly sort of adjust themselves to some. It's a weird sort of corruption of morality also. I mean, it is very strange. But it also essentially means that government doesn't have to do anything specific to address disadvantage, because it's just sort of passed the buck onto the private sector instead of, actually it could have encouraged the private sector to do it the right way in some sense. They could have encouraged the private sector to come up with extra training, extra things. I mean, the government could have done a lot of things. It could have essentially bolstered the credentials of certain candidates that were seen to be part of groups that of persons that have disadvantage by subsidizing or setting up things that allow for, things about transport or housing that was conducive to the particular business that they were trying to facilitate amelioration of whatever disadvantage there was. But then you're tackling a specific disadvantage, and you're tackling it through specific means, or through some kind of thing in which the business itself can have some kind of transportation thing which is then subsidized through the state or something like that, or is given some kind of status via this specific legislation. But the idea that all of this sort of, it's weird, because essentially when you're forcing people to employ direct discrimination in terms of their decision making in order to tackle disadvantage. That's, first of all, that's an indirect tackling of disadvantage, but also, damn, I just lost the other idea of what I was going to say. Essentially, it's because it's disconnected from the disadvantage by almost two levels of abstraction. Um, it's essentially a compensation device. It's compensating the identity. Um, it's not even compensating the person involved, because that person involved is not being identified through their disadvantage. They're just being identified by the group designation, which the government policy has said requires you to directly discriminate in favor of. Um, so it's, you know, it's very, very strange. What's the summary of this point is that that essentially it stops becoming affirmative action, and it's a weird sort of welfare program. It's a weird sort of compensation. And you're doing that by essentially corrupting something that we call freedom of association, which is effectively poisoning the secular culture and the non-racialist values of the society completely, because instead of actually saying, you know, this is the thing that we are specifically tackling, we're tackling this unknown quantity of collective guilt, and trying to create a vehicle of re-establishing some kind of collective pride via the token that we're taking as the representative of this collective enterprise. You know, it's so antithetical to social justice. It really is. It's the, I mean, this is a fascistic categorization of life, and you know, it really does. All it does is echo that narrative, which is strange in so many ways, because it doesn't actually ever get the job done. It doesn't actually ever address something tangible. It's always, and it's strange as well, because also these policies that are in this vein, that are in this spirit, are fundamentally destructive, because the more that they fail, the more that they validate their ideological perspective. You know, it's weird, but that is the first goal, is to increase identity consciousness and increase the standing of the ideological perspective. And that is how they have essentially grown this cancer within the New South Africa, to the extent to which the New South Africa at least, the Constitution as it stands has already been killed virtually. I mean, by the Constitutional Court, that is in league with this policy corruption that lies within the state, and within politics in general, as we've even seen that this kind of racialist demagoguery, even Masi Mayamane, you know, is sort of, they all have this corrupt morality, and they can't see a problem with it. You know, it's. I know, the civil rights movement, I mean, I wonder if you can compare that with the South African Revolution. I mean, there were, you know, obviously there were some factions within South African politics, there always have been, of a kind of black nationalism. Um, they were suppressed pretty well by the old guard of the ANC, by the non-racialist intellectual sort of movement, which I think got into a bad state from a lot of outside atmospheric pressure. Um, and I think in the early days it was pretty obvious that, you know, that way of thinking was the apartheid way of thinking. So I guess you even had the the, the memory of apartheid to contrast with um, with the new political paradigm that Mandela and the New South Africa and the Constitution represents, which has now been effectively abandoned. It doesn't really have a political voice. Well, you can't say that. I mean, COPE, I think, has. They have not articulated strong. I mean, you know, they have been publicly. I mean, I've seen. I don't track South African politics too thoroughly because it's too depressing. But I mean, I've seen the kind of the abject disgust from the COPE leader about this kind of politics, but he hasn't really. Um, uh, he hasn't put it in his target and put it under fire. He's just kind of he's responded to it in a virtuous way, but he hasn't taken up arms against it. Well, and I say that after admitting that I'm not thoroughly plugged in to South African politics. It's just it's far too unengaging in that it's morally bankrupt effectively. There's no clear ideological discussion about I mean, for me it's very obvious that it is the thing that promotes state corruption is this ideological corruption, which is the moral corruption. It's the same corruption. It is the one hand is washing the other hand. The identity consciousness is what has been covering up and what has been promoting the kind of state looting. And because I mean it is always paradoxical and hypocritical because the ideology is so dysfunctional that you actually have to at some point say it always compromises itself because it's built on fudging reality fundamentally, you know, because the narrative who is ever the true representation, you know, of their identity. It just doesn't work, you know, and to actually believe that you have to dehumanize on such a stark level, and you have to it's weird because it promotes the wrong kind of liberty. It doesn't really have a real sense of real freedom. um, it's like the liberty to disrupt, the liberty to destabilize institutions, the liberty to just debase. um, it's kind of its radicalism is based on this idea that like the more hurt that you can display, the more that you're owed in some sense, and so it's sort of focused on a weird sort of self-agonism, um, in order to perpetuate and sustain its feelings, which then it's able to project onto the present context, and and the source of that projection is the historical narrative. So they get to sort of echo the historical narrative, until some Führer gets to represent the social justice, gets to represent until someone is willing to come and adopt the whole political accountability from the identity, not even from the people, because the people are just identities at that point. So it just gets more and more dehumanizing, And like a lot of the half-baked people, like Masi Mayamane, who thinks that there's, you can feed this ravenous beast, some meat, and you can keep it happy, or something like that. It's fundamentally unsustainable, because the rhetoric itself will automatically it doesn't ever get fed. It doesn't ever satisfy. Like at what point do it's like, oh, according to the statistics, it has such arbitrary triggers, and effectively the only way to satisfy it is with an impossible condition, which is this kind of the outcome and statistical things, but because of the means that it uses, it can't actually deal with the core symptoms. It deals with the symptom and not with, it doesn't ever make the proper diagnosis. And so, essentially, because its target is some kind of statistical equality and not actually empowering people, it just doesn't engage in reality in a way that actually is amenable to development. Because essentially it is working on the identity, it's not working on the people on the ground. It doesn't actually make contact with the people, it only makes contact with the identity. And it will actually develop identity equality. It does actually achieve identity equality. The problem is that it makes that equality at a much lower level, because it just keeps on redistributing the power and the prestige in some sense. It doesn't know how to grow the pie. It doesn't know how to develop the thing, because it doesn't engage in the reality. It engages with the reality of identity, which is already a level of abstraction and generalization. And it's a completely different beast to actual living, breathing people. And so it does things to facilitate identity. And that's actually what we've got in this country now. We've got a sabotaged economy. We've got so many things sabotaged. But the only thing that has grown in this country, that has developed well, is identity consciousness. That is what we reap what we sow. We've used this poisonous ideology, and it has grown in power. It has grown in political power, in political currency. This is where we are at. And so the corruption has grown as this ideology has strengthened. And it's weird, because it's actually using the Jungian sort of, there's a Jungian coined phrase, which is, what you resist persists. And that's exactly what the whole ideology is built on. It's built on resistance. And so it just metastasizes. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Anyway.